I don't understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politic.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, because we know we have people here with us all over the world. Greetings and welcome. My name is Rick Simmons. I work in a bookstore in Seattle called Elliott Bay Book Company. And on behalf of all the people who are staging this production today, we are delighted to be celebrating the publication of Arundhati Roy's newest book, Azadi, Freedom, Fascism, Fiction. And this is being launched with her in New Delhi. So she is in her evening hours. And I'm in Seattle, where it's still a new day. And Nick Estes, who I'll say more of it shortly, is, I think, an hour ahead of me. And we know all of you joining us are everywhere around the spectrum. You may even be earlier in the morning than here and later in the night than it is in New Delhi. The publication of this book today is an auspicious one. And first, though, to acknowledge and thank all the good work that Haymarket Books, who is the book's publisher, has done, not only to make this occasion happen, but also in publishing this book. Haymarket is a publisher based in Chicago in the U.S. That has been around since 2001 and is dedicated to social justice books and has done an amazing array of books and has been publishing, coming along several of Arundhati Roy's nonfiction books that have come around these past 20 years. And I think if you I'm not sure what all people are seeing this beforehand, but you can certainly go to haymarketbooks.org and see what all they do and they have amazing books coming and others that they've done, and books particularly speaking to the moment we're in. And so they are a huge part of why we're here today. Also, in Seattle, one of the other co-presenters of this day is an organization called Tasveer. It's a South Asian arts organization based with a strong social justice bent that has came about in 2002 in response to what was happening in the U.S. in the wake of 9/11, and has done these ambitious South Asian film festivals, and now is increasingly doing literary festivals. This year's versions of both will be online. You can go to tasveer.org and see more of what they're about. They've also helped present Arundhati in some of her recent Seattle visits. And Elliott Bay Book Company, where I work, is an independent bookstore I've been fortunate to work there for most of its 47 years. And it's been doing the long, hard work of putting good and vital books, such as the books Haymarket publishes, in people's hands. And to say a little of our history here, I don't want to go too far out on a limb, but I believe we may have a longer history with Arundhati than any other bookstore, at least outside of India. For it was in the spring of 1997 that she came to the U.S. for just a few cities, and Seattle was, I think, one of the first, and certainly took her work to heart and soul, the God of Small Things, which this was before all that would happen with that book happened. But as anyone who's read that book knows, what really happens is in that remarkable book. And we've had visits since. Her last visit was for her second novel, which came 20 years after The God of Small Things. That was The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. There was a 20-year period there, and there were certainly people in much of that time who wondered what Arundhati Roy was, where she was with her writing, and those were the people in terms of looking for another novel. There were other writings, and over the series of what was basically a 20-year period, these writings, which were published initially in Indian magazines, Frontline and Outlook primarily, and then became to the U.S. and elsewhere in usually the form of small books of 2 or 3 essays, these small collections, Power Politics, War Talk, others. And they kept happening, various things that Arundhati Roy felt compelled to speak out about, or things she was summoned to speak out about, and where those places met. And in India and other countries, some of those books are published under titles. I would sometimes get excited seeing there was another new book that I hadn't seen, but usually it was a slightly different combination of the same essays and with a different title. This was all sort of addressed with the publication last year of the collected nonfiction, My Seditious Heart, and this is this tome, which also is noteworthy for its thickness, because it's 1,000 pages of writing that happened. And as things developed, many of the people came to her work came first to these essays, and some went back and read the novels. So she's had that course in history with her work. The book she's here for today is actually a book already just 2 years on from what the essays in My Seditious Heart. This book, Azadi, Freedom, Fascism, Fiction. This is his very publication launch day here in the U.S. It's coming out in a few days in India. Are 9 pieces that have been written since then, and these pieces have a compelling, vital power that speaks, that address certainly to things in India, but with resonance and relevance here in the U.S. That's the subject we'll talk about today, where things are. With Arundhati will be Nick Estes, who is joining us from Albuquerque. He is a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He's a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He is also the co-founder of an organization started in 2014 called The Red Nation, and go to therednation.org and you will see what that is. He's also the author of a book published last year by Verso, which is another independent radical press, along with Haymarket, called Our History is the Future. A powerful book, which I think we have to send to Arundhati, because I don't think the book has made it to India, but it should. And he also, later last year, co-edited this anthology along with Laksharan Dillon, Standing with Standing Rock, an anthology by writing of activists and scholars of what happened at Standing Rock. So Arundhati and Nick will have a conversation for the next hour or so. You are invited to put questions in the chat field as you're watching, and those will be fed to Nick, and he will ask, work those in. Also to say that today is being live captioned. If you wish to have access to that, there's information in the chat, instructions in the chat. Tess Stevenson is doing that. And so yes, your questions, your comments, the closed captioning, and I will disappear in just a moment, and will reappear at the very end but to say that you're in great hands now, and to thank you all for wherever you are and all the places you are in joining us for this. I know I can only imagine the energy that would be in a room with Arundhati and Nick, and this is their first meeting too. That's also for all the things we miss in not being together. We also get to bring people together in a different way. So this will be part of what we get to benefit from that. So direct your good energy, your focus, what would be applause in the affirmation and support to these two people who are doing great work, and particularly to what the book you're about to hear from that Arundhati Roy has read. So thank you all, and please welcome Arundhati and Roy and Nick Estes.
Thanks so much, Rick. That introduction was really wonderful. And as I was preparing for this particular interview, I was reading a little bit about Arundhati Roy's background. And as much as her work is, the things that she has written have been very powerful, you can also look at the things she has been criticized for and persecuted for by the Indian state as a testament to the power of this, her particular work and role as a writer. So for me personally, this is a great honor. I'm a huge fan of Arundhati Roy. I haven't told her this offline, but I'm incredibly nervous, and because it's a huge honor for me to just be talking to you and to have the opportunity to read this wonderful book, because it speaks to this moment in time. And I wanted to begin this interview with a question about the book's title, which is Azadi, which is a Kashmiri word for freedom. And you say the first word that comes to mind when you think of Azadi is not novel, because, you know, as you write in the introduction, a novel gives a writer the freedom to be as complicated as she wants, to move through worlds, languages, and time, through societies, communities, and politics. So in many ways, you read the recent and long history of India through Kashmir. Can you explain your choice of using this word and how it shapes this collection of essays?
Azadi is a word which is perhaps Persian in origin, and then Persian came and mingled with Hindi and Hindustani and became an Urdu word, and more recently it traveled, I think, from the Iranian Revolution. It was used by feminists. Hum kya chahte azadi, what do we want? Freedom. And then now and meaning for several decades has been the haunting cry of Kashmiris who have been fighting the Indian military occupation, who have been killed in their thousands for it. But oddly enough, there's a deathly silence in India about the Kashmiri struggle. There's a silence from the left. There's a silence from the liberals. Of course, there's a lot of noise from the right, which covers the real truth of the story. But also, what is very dangerous in this part of the subcontinent is that, let's say, the large Muslim population in India, which is, I think, 15% or 13%, which is, millions, hundreds of millions of people, are a kind of hostage to the rivalry with Pakistan, to the Kashmiri independence movement. And the Indian Muslims have a completely different space that they occupy. They don't have the option of even thinking about freedom. They have to think about how to live here with dignity. And recently, this government, the Modi government, the right-wing Hindu Nationalist government, came up with a new citizenship law, which was piggybacking on an old thing called the National Register of Citizens, which was sort of reactivated in the state of Assam, which borders Bangladesh. And some 20 million people were off that register, people who had been born and who had lived in India for generations. And on top of that, the government passed another law called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was like very blatantly anti-Muslim. And so suddenly, there was this really odd juxtaposition that happened last year, where Kashmir which had a special status in the Indian Constitution. On the 5th of August, it was stripped of its status. It was sort of integrated into India in the most brutal manner possible. There's an internet siege. It's the most densely militarized zone in the world. Their phones were put off, and almost for the whole of this past year, Kashmir has been under curfew and silenced, lockdown, COVID, all of it, But while Kashmir was silenced, massive protests came out on the streets of India by this new anti-Muslim citizenship law, and their chant was also Azadi. So while the Kashmiri Azadi chant was silenced, here there was the swell of a demand for a different kind of Azadi, obviously not independence as in secession or an independent state, but a cry for dignity, for human rights, for being treated as equal citizens. And that too was brutally crushed. The rest of India sort of became, not with the kind of cruelty that Kashmiris have witnessed, but, it began to seem like there was curfew, there were internet cuts, people were brutalized, killed. And so this series of essays really began to ask, what is the connection between the Kashmiri call for Azadi and the new cry on the Indian streets? Is it a chasm? Is it a bridge? And, and the essays are written from the point of view of a literary imagination, which then basically interrogates the idea of Azadi in its myriad forms. I can't hear you, Nick.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the literary imagination that you're talking about, I think you make a point in one of the essays, which is a talk that you gave about how, your writer friends were approaching you and talking about, well, when are you going to get back to writing? When are you going to get back to the quote unquote real work of a fiction writer? And you make a very powerful point, not just in this book, but I think throughout your career, that what you are doing is a form of literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And so can you talk a little bit about your role as a writer and how you see it playing out, not just in the realm of, political analysis and commenting on current events, but also imagining new worlds through, whether it's through The God of Small Things or The Ministry, your most recent novel?
So when I wrote The God of Small Things, obviously I used to work in, I'm an architect, and then I worked in cinema, and this was my first book. And who could anticipate that kind of attention for a first book? It won the Booker Prize and it sold millions of copies, and I found myself very suspicious of this kind of embrace by an establishment that I've always been very suspicious of. I felt like my proteins were being sort of melted down, and I was just being turned into some domestic. Fame is also very domesticating. Everyone wants you to write the same book again, and it's different things, but. And that was just around the time that India had sort of shifted from being this non-aligned power, a poor country, but a poor country with some spine, with some dignity, with a great socialist underpinning. Kerala, where I grew up, was the first democratically elected communist government in the world, if that's not an oxymoron, but whatever. So I grew up with the, strikes and the big protests and the red flags, and the revolution was coming. And then suddenly by the 90s, everything changed, and the markets were opened. of course, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and India aligned itself with the free market, with the US, with Israel, and suddenly the literary imagination, the cinematic imagination, the poetic imagination, the public language, everything changed. And in 97, I was like on the cover of every magazine. In 98, the right-wing government came in and did this series of nuclear tests. And I was sort of being marketed as this sort of the new India, the new India taking its place in the high table. And I knew that if I didn't have the option of keeping quiet, because if I kept quiet, that meant I agreed with all that. So I wrote the first political essay, which was called The End of Imagination. And, within like hours, I was kicked off the pedestal of this, great sort of literary sensation. And there was this incredible disappointment in me, but people around me that, how could you have done this? And I literally in that essay, I said, I was talking about the fact that nuclear weapons it's not just whether they are used or not that is the problem, but how they colonize your imagination, how they nationalize your imagination, how they change the public language. And I said, if it's anti-Hindu and anti-Indian to have this imagination implanted in my brain, then I secede. I declare myself a mobile Republican. This was like, in this orgy of nationalism, the, fairy princess had just come out and shat on everyone, more or less. So I was just like out. But, there was another world which suddenly kind of open up to me, and I traveled. I began to write these essays, and people were unsure. What is this? Is it academic? Is it a journalist? Is it a pamphleteer? They were somewhere between genres because there was certainly it was an intervention. It was urgent, it was furious, it wasn't, and it was more like I saw that these movements, like the big anti-dam movement, the displacement of these nations of people, of ancient people, there needed to be a story. Like a story was like putting a weapon in the hands of the movement, So I was not writing what people call truth to power. I was not writing some on the one hand this and on the other hand that and on the third hand this. I was saying this is our fight and I am the writer on this side of the line, and people, I think things might have changed a little very recently, but there's this kind of fear of a writer being political, as if the god of small things wasn't political. The people in Kerala understood it was political, and dealing with the subject that was absolutely taboo, which is to talk about caste and the ways in which the left has not been able to deal with it. But people managed to change that into, oh, it's so beautiful, it's about children, the language, So people kind of work hard to soften the edges sometimes of writing, which is which makes them uneasy. But for me, when I started writing the political essays, they would get translated immediately into Indian languages, made into pamphlets, distributed in forests, and they understood it as literature. People on the front lines, So that's what I said in one of the essays, that for me, there's something about literature that is constructed between readers and writers, not between critics and literature festivals and reviewers, but between readers and writers, which is urgent and which is a kind of shelter, So it's there are some moments in my life, to me, are so, I mean, more than any royalties, more than any, awards. Like, I remember being in a village in Bengal, very late at night, walking through the paddy fields, and there was a huge standoff because the government, which happened to be a left government, actually was trying to take over the land, give it to a huge chemical plant, and there was firing. I could hear the firing happening in the distance, and I was just walking around along this bund, and this man just appeared in the shadows, and he said, I just want to thank you for understanding what we're doing. They think, the other side thinks we have weapons. We don't have weapons. We just pretend. We just use sticks and silhouette and pretend we have weapons. We don't have anything. But we're fighting, and very few people, at that point, everyone in the TV studios will start turning Gandhian and denouncing violence when it's easy for them, expecting everyone to just lie down and die while the land is taken. Which is why I was so happy to read your piece in the Jacobin. I just thought, goodness, how much you would have had to talk about if you had come here and walked with the comrades in the forests of central India.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I mean, there's a lot to be said, and I think, one thing that a friend of mine once said, her name is Layli Long Soldier. She's a poet. I tried to be a poet, not good at it. But she said, you have to look for poetry. Poetry is more than just words. You have to look for poetry in actions. And it's the job of the writer to basically capture, or to be able to see that kind of poetry. And one thing that I've really been inspired by your writing specifically is that you don't confine yourself to one thing. And I think there's a lot of expectation for people to be kind of characterized as a certain kind of writer, like you're a fiction writer, you're a poet. And we confront that, especially within literary nationalism, especially people who are not part of, kind of the European tradition, but nonetheless have inherited, the baggage of that, whether it's through colonialism or imperialism. And one of the ways that I really appreciated that you push back on that is this idea of translation, and the multiple languages that one has to know and to understand. And I'm not just talking about languages that people speak, because capitalism itself is a language. It transforms relations into profit. It transforms things into money. And I've been thinking about this because I'm writing this piece, and I haven't crystallized what I actually, how I understand it. But I felt like you were really kind of challenging. In some ways, you were being more cosmopolitan than the cosmopolitan people, because you're looking at a place that is, as you say, is simultaneously captured in different, centuries, but also it's overlapped in nations and in different kinds of people that can't be just, encompassed in one kind of single literary tradition.
Yeah, I think, India, one of the essays I say that if a novel shouldn't have an enemy, but if the Ministry of Utmost Happiness has an enemy, then it's the idea of one nation, one language, one religion, which is what the Modi government and the fascists around him are trying to push for. But in India, there are something like more than 700 languages spoken. 22 of them are, official languages. And within each language, there is such a history of colonizing, being colonized. There's so many, there's so many cycles of respect and disrespect. The words that will be used to describe this caste or that gender, and so like the first essay in the book, of course, the caption is a line from Neruda, which says, "In what language does rain fall over tormented cities?" And it's really talking about the Ministry of Utmost Happiness sort of swimming, the characters not are swimming in this ocean of languages. And you see, for example, the most shattering memory of people in modern day India is the memory of the massacres that took place in 1947 when India was partitioned, and Pakistan and India became two separate countries. Although there were many nations, so the violence was of assimilation as much as it was of partition. But one of the things you see is that before the partition happened, language was partitioned. The language that we used to call Hindustani was then sort of partitioned into Urdu, which was supposedly spoken by Muslims, and Hindi by Hindus. And the violence of that, continues to this day. I mean, to this day, you'll have fascist mobs go and raze to the ground some, poet who wrote 300 years ago, some poet of love. And so language, language has been at the heart of much of the violence in this continent that is masquerading as a nation. And so a lot of and even as I was saying earlier, when they did the nuclear test, you could see the public language changed. And so now you have, when they start off on these national register of citizens, and you have people who live in these little islands in the most distant parts of the mighty Brahmaputra river, which keeps changing course, which has storms and tornadoes and consumes people's lives. But all of them have these little plastic bags with their documents, and they have internalized this bureaucracies, legacy papers and voter list. And, similarly, the people in the Narmada Valley who are being displaced by the dam, they have a whole other language by which they are described in government files, PAP, that is project affected person, or, reservoir affected or canal affected or whatever. And so, like as a writer in this part of the world, to study love and violence and nationhood and religion, language is a perfect entry point,
Mm-hmm. And, kind of elaborating on this idea of language and the partition of language, you talk about caste quite a bit in your work, and it's something, this is me being the ugly American. We have a racial hierarchy in this country. I wouldn't say that it's comparable, but there are similarities. But one thing that you talk about, it's not so much a caste system as you say. It's about Brahmanism and the re-Brahmanization of sections of Indian society, specifically through this organization, which you call one of the most powerful organizations in India right now, which is the RSS. Can you explain a little bit about that? Because I think reading some of your interviews, but then also people have messaged me privately and asked, well, isn't Arundhati Roy Brahmin herself? Isn't she from this upper caste?
No, I'm not actually. My mother is a Christian, and my father, he belonged to an organization called the Brahmo Samaj, which is not Brahmin, but he also became a Christian. So no, I'm not a Brahmin. And when the anti-caste movement has traditionally used the word Brahminism, it isn't about Brahmins. It's about the idea of this kind of caste hierarchy, which is, so it's not just Brahmins that practice Brahminism, but I would say fundamentally, the difference between race and caste is only that caste has also given itself religious sanction. Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, all of them, at least in their texts, may say that, all human beings are equal or brothers, but no, they also have their, but in the religious text, you have a stipulated hierarchy, and each caste, so you have four divisions which are called varnas: the Brahmins, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, the Kshatriyas, the Shudras, and then outside of it are the outcasts. But each of these is divided into these tiny little jatis, which are castes, and each jati has a hereditary occupation. So this is the terror, and you have so the Brahmins are the priests, the Vaishyas are the traders, the Kshatriyas are the warriors, the Shudras are the menials, and the outcasts, of course, are the Dalits, the untouchable, the unseeable, and so on. The violence of thinking like that, it's unbelievable, And if you look at Indian society, and you look at even, I would say, most Indian liberal intellectuals, even left-wing intellectuals, they will just elide this issue, which is actually the engine on which Indian society runs, So I've written a little book called The Doctor and the Saint, and it's about the conversations and debates between the most beloved leader of the Dalits, Dr. Ambedkar, and the most revered human being in the world, probably, Gandhi. And while I was researching this, I, who am like everyone else in the world, and particularly millions of Indians, indoctrinated in a completely false falsification of what Gandhi was, what he stood for. And so I went back, and this little text is based not on speculation, not on interpretation, but only producing his own writing. At the time when Gandhi was in South Africa, all of us are told that he fought racism, he fought segregation. No, his first battle in South Africa was for a third entrance to be opened to the Durban post office so that Indians and blacks would not have to share the same entrance. And he continuously in his writing made a difference between the upper caste Indians, who he said are Aryans and the brothers of the Imperial Britain, and the lower castes who are liars and, basically unreformable. And then I traced that from his time in South Africa right up to the end of his life, how his views on race were informed by his childhood views on caste, and then how caste came back, the attitude to workers, the attitude to women. And so, like I said in these essays, not elaborated upon like I have in The Doctor and the Saint, but fascism, which we are experiencing now, is, it adorns itself with fake news, but the fake news is built on a fake history. And liberals and left-wing intellectuals laugh at the kind of corny fake history of the right, but they themselves have created a fake history which elides the role of caste in this country, which is absolutely, the dishonesty is unbelievable.
And I think recently, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, which I would say that have erupted all over the world, it's probably one of the largest mass protests in world history. The only thing I can think of comparable to them in this recent moment, or I guess in recent history, is the mass demonstrations against the U.S. invasion of Iraq back in 2003. But in South Africa, I believe it was in South Africa, I could be wrong, they toppled a Gandhi statue. And in the United States,
I think it was in Ghana. Although
or Ghana.
There are movements in South Africa saying Gandhi must fall. And the thing is, I mean, it's difficult to talk about this subject in, just an interview, because it's such a difficult subject. And this, in The Doctor and the Saint, I'm not saying that Gandhi had nothing to recommend himself. Of course, I'm not saying that. He was a brilliant politician, a cunning politician. He had a lot of things that I think were visionary, but we cannot, we cannot build an understanding of who we are and what we are fighting for unless we are honest about his views on race, his views on caste, and his views on women. And if you confront them, it's very hard to prefix the word Mahatma to his name for me.
I want to change gears just a little bit and talk about, an element in your writing that I think a lot of folks here in this part of the world can identify with is the rise of somebody like Modi, and specifically his alignment with somebody like Trump. And you write this in the Nation piece that came out, which I read the day it came off the presses, how this kind of howdy Modi, spectacle that happened in Texas, was happening alongside Google Trends that showed a surge in searches for like phrases like "marry a Kashmiri girl" or "buy land in Kashmir," which was basically advertising territory for Indian settlers to come in and to colonize. But then also, while Trump visited India in his most recent meeting with Modi, there was a massacre happening. And
in my city.
In your city. And both of them, operate like Modi seems to be a little bit more on the softer edge in his public appearance, while, having an iron fist, obviously, in his crackdown against dissent, whereas Trump doesn't really care. But the thing that they share in common is an authoritarianism, as well as a make-believe fantasy, and how they've dealt with not only dissent, but also the current pandemic. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that and this relationship, this very loving relationship between these two leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the difference between them is that Trump, Trump, of course, he does have his militias and he does have his media outlets, but, the institutions, whether it's the army, whether it's the intelligence services, and whether it's the mainstream, not Fox News, but, the mainstream sort of press, are showing a kind of resistance to him. But Modi is a person who has, from the time he was a very young adult, been a member of this organization called the RSS, which has modeled itself on Mussolini's black shirts, whose ideologues have openly praised Hitler. But that's fine. I mean, they have a massive infrastructure. They have a militia of something like 600,000 people. They have these branches, hundreds of thousands of branches all over the country. They are the state,
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between the two is that one has the organization of fascism behind him, as well as the 400 24/7 news channels, as well as a great portion of Bollywood, which is an incredible ambassador of the Hindu right, with many honorable exceptions. So you have a situation here where it's a machine that's running, and all the institutions of democracy have been taken over. But both of them are great friends. And in fact, one of the reasons why Modi didn't react early to the COVID pandemic was because Trump was visiting and there was going to be this huge Namaste Trump, meeting in Gujarat, which of course turned out to be a hub of massive coronavirus soon after that. But by the time Trump came from Gujarat to Delhi, you had the protesters who were on the streets, very much like the Black Lives Matter protests. There were millions of people on the streets against the citizenship law, which was I mean, by then it had become about more than just that, and there was poetry, there were students, universities were being, just battered by police and so on. But then you had the massacre while Trump was here, where, I mean, it was just, the brutality was unbelievable and it was exhibitionist. And we saw the videos of the police, with these battered Muslim men lying on the street, forcing them to sing the national anthem, forcing them to, mocking them about Azadi, mobs, burning down mosques and so on. And now, of course, the whole narrative has been turned and Muslims are being blamed for killing Muslims, and major, human rights activists, students, all are being put into prison every day. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the three geniuses of the early 21st century, Modi, Trump, and Bolsonaro, are on the top of the charts of coronavirus, But now, today, the newspapers are telling us, not the TV channels, but the newspapers, that the Indian economy has shrunk 23.9%. Because Modi ordered a lockdown, because fascists love spectacle. So his spectacle was, I'm going to call the most strict lockdown the world has ever known. And 1.38 billion people were given 4 hours notice. And then it was like a curfew. And that was like a chemical experiment, because suddenly you had millions of working class people who had no homes, who had no money, who had no way of getting home to their villages, walking, hundreds of kilometers home, getting beaten by the police, getting sprayed with, bleach, and carrying the virus to the four corners of the country. So right now we are sitting on an economy that's crashed, millions of people out of work, a developing war on the borders of Ladakh, which used to be a part of Kashmir, India, whose army was, always on the alert on the Western Front with Pakistan, now has to be battle ready on a 3,000 kilometer long front on high altitude warfare ready, so they don't have, forget weapons, they don't even have warm clothes. And in an economy that's collapsing. So we are, and we are looking at, it's almost, you almost feel like you're sitting on the crater of a volcano, just cushioned with a thick layer of propaganda. That's it,
So, I mean, this is really, that was kind of my next question. And because the New York Times reported yesterday that, the Indian economy, contracted nearly 24%, which is the most drastic fall in decades, right? And
ever,
not just for this is a global thing. It's not just for India. It's specifically as a country, but for I think the U.S. economy shrank 9.5% and Japan 7.6%, to give people an idea. I was thinking about this in terms of even a country like Beirut that had that explosion. And they estimated it, initially to be about $5 billion USD, in damages, but they didn't account for the actual blast radius, which now they think is around $25 billion. The GDP, the gross domestic product of a country like Lebanon, is 50 billion. So half of its GDP was knocked out in almost in a single blast.
But in India, we must remember that it isn't just because of the Corona lockdown.
Right.
It was already before Corona, a 45-year high of unemployment. Modi had, in 2016, come out one night and announced demonetization, where 80% of the currency was made no longer legal tender. So it was like some economist said, he had just taken a gun and shot the heart of the engine of a moving car. Then now the wheels have been taken away, but the problem is that the poor do not exist in the imagination of the elite anymore. Since the 1990s, even if you look at Bollywood films, they used to be about fighting, about the poor, about workers, about unions, about villages. Now they just, these films that are shown in malls, they don't have poverty in them. Literature has, for the most part, no more poor people in it. Poetry has lost the poor. So somehow there's no way of planning for them if they don't exist in your imagination. Which is why when they started walking, when the lockdown was called, it was, they had been hidden away in the crevices of cities, unacknowledged, and suddenly they appeared. So you are in a situation where it's like it's just been happening. Like I recently said to someone, it feels like a diabetic who's just had a silent heart attack after silent heart attack after silent heart attack. But the diabetes is just the propaganda that masks the illness, And so suddenly you have a situation where the heart is failing.
Mm. In your kind of closing essay in this book, around the coronavirus, you write, I think it's a very pertinent kind of phrase. It says the pandemic is a portal, and you talk about how in the past pandemics have forced societies to break with the past and imagine their world anew. And I think this can be said of many crises that societies face. I feel after reading this book, not just reading this book, but the times we live in, I feel less pessimistic about that new world. And I think a lot of people, feel the same way. And I guess a lot of the questions that we're getting, even in the chat now, is like, how do we imagine a new world in this particular moment, as we've seen, the intersection of the rise of fascism with this coronavirus pandemic. And now we also have the question of global climate change that seems to have taken a backseat in this larger conversation.
Well, that's, when I said the pandemic is a portal and the last paragraphs are about what are we going to leave behind and what are we going to drag through the portal? Are we going to drag the carcasses of our dead rivers and our smoky skies and, the idea that, our oceans are now filling up with PPE suits and masks. But I think more important is, to understand the ways in which we are being controlled now, apart from the fact that nothing suits the fascists more than having us all, obviously siloed into our homes. In a country like India, that's not possible because people don't have, the politics of the lockdown is completely the reverse here because people don't have homes. A lockdown means social compression, not social distancing here because it's just impossible, So you are seeing data which shows that in poorer areas where people have been cramped up and people have just had to go about their work, there is a kind of greater resistance and a sort of herd immunity coming out. But I think the real danger that we face is that the idea that the classes that can be socially distanced will begin to view those that can't be as a biohazardous body, and there'll be a lot of attempt to try and see if the world can be made to work where the walking classes, the labor classes that had to walk thousands of kilometers home, will be separated from the flying classes. And can we have production in which these two classes don't meet at all? Like, can we do away with the biohazardous body, the surplus people then, So the governments have shown, all these governments, meaning the governments that we are talking about, yours, ours, have shown have shown every sign that they will seize upon this pandemic to increase controls, to increase surveillance, to increase the polarization of who's wealthy and who's not. But at some point, that is going to break apart, which I think you're seeing in the United States. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I think that people, like, even this last 2 months in the run up to the election, people probably do understand that whatever happens in the elections are not going to be the way to a new world. Although it's very important that Trump is voted out, but the new people that come in will not come in with a new imagination. And the polarization is so deadly that the chances of a kind of violence on the streets is very, very high. Similarly over here, the chaos that we can expect as things break down, maybe we shouldn't be so scared of it, is what I'm saying, because nothing is going to transition so beautifully, so easily, without a kind of, without a kind of real battle. Nothing is going to change. It's terrifying to think that way, but I think that way now, that maybe many of us will perish in it, but the polarization is so huge and so obvious, and conversations are not even happening.
I had a final question, and you don't have to answer it, but I wanted to just ask, what is the future of Indian democracy?
So, I wonder if I wanted to read something. Somebody sent it to me, and it was like a little passage that I had written many years ago about democracy. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah. Someone actually just sent me this yesterday. So this was from a essay I wrote called "Democracy's Failing Light." Not in this book, in a previous collection. And I said the question here really is, what have we done to democracy? What have we turned it into? What happens once democracy has been used up, when it has been hollowed out and emptied of meaning? What happens when each of its institutions has metastasized into something dangerous? What happens now that democracy and the free market have fused into a single predatory organism with a thin, constricted imagination that revolves almost entirely around the idea of maximizing profit? Is it possible to reverse this process? Can something that has mutated go back to being what it used to be? So, when I look at India, in India, let's say, the British left in 1947. By the 1960s, there were revolutionary struggles here, against feudalism, against, for calling for land to the tiller, calling for the redistribution of wealth, calling for revolution, By the 80s, and those movements were crushed, mercilessly crushed. Then by the 1980s and 90s, you had the large anti-dam movements, indigenous people fighting against displacement. So from asking for the redistribution of wealth, we were reduced to saying whatever little people have, don't take that away. Those movements were crushed. Now you're reduced to begging for your citizenship, because these citizenship laws are not for refugees. They are not for people coming, migrants. They are for people who already live here, like the Nazi regime in Germany decided the Nuremberg laws meant that citizens had to give the government a set of documents that the government would then decide, are you a citizen or are you not? So you have people now being reduced to begging for their citizenship. The ground they stand on is not firm anymore. And of course, just praying that you won't go to jail tomorrow, and the laws that have been passed now. So the question you ask, what kind of a democracy is India? I'd say that India is a one-party democracy, which is an oxymoron, because the machinery, including the election machinery, is compromised. So I do not see that the crisis we are in now, the crater, the volcano that is about to erupt, is going to be soothed by any election. Because in the elections, the media, the machinery, the money, the data, everything belongs to one party, So that's why I say there will be an implosion.
So we have some questions from viewers that I'd like to get to, and you've kind of answered some of these. So if you want to flip it however you want, please feel free to do so. But there was a recent book published by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's
No,
a US.
I of course I know. I mean, I've met her actually, but I haven't managed to read the book.
Okay. So I'll skip that one because it was about your perspectives on that. The other one was going back to Gandhi and whether or not he ever changed his racist kind of caste-based views.
So, in The Doctor and the Saint, it traces Gandhi's writings right from, the 1860 something to 1946. And while he, he's known to have campaigned against caste, he actually didn't change his views, I would say. He had a very missionary approach to it. He said he was against the idea of untouchability, but if you look at essays he wrote, like the ideal Bhangi is the municipal sweeper that used to clean, whose caste-based hereditary job was to clean shit. And he writes about how this is such a holy job, and what the ideal Bhangi should do, and the Brahmin should always be a Brahmin, the Bhangi should always be a Bhangi, but everybody should be treated equally. So but I would say that rather than listen to me, read that book, because it's a complicated and a little scary for me to just talk off the top of my head, because that book is, it really quotes the writing and quotes the sources, and it deals with the complications of that debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar. And but let me say just that after having written it and researched against my own indoctrination, I was appalled.
The other question, I'm going to modify it a little bit because you kind of already answered part of it, but is there an organized front to fight the rise of fascism in India today?
No, so the political, the political parties that are in opposition to the BJP, the parliamentary parties, whether it's the Congress, whether it's the left, have more or less been decimated. Even the anti-caste parties have been decimated. So the opposition in parliament exists in the form that the BJP wishes it to exist, doing work that only helps them. There was when the huge protest sprang up against the citizenship law, there were students. It was almost beginning to look like a revolution, but then coronavirus came, and it was smashed. People have been arrested. Like in Delhi, people were killed, and now hundreds of people are in jail. Students, professors, activists are being called in by the police, threatened, picked off one by one. There was no lockdown for the repression. There was only a lockdown for people. And so right now, there isn't an organized front. Although, an organized front may not be even possible in a country like India, because an organization also can be broken quite easily, But I do believe that the situation is so dire now that something new will come up, because people can't live like this.
The next question has to do with the reporting, I'm assuming, on the issues around Kashmir and how they're reported on, how journalists report on what's happening in Kashmir within India. And I guess the question is, how do reporters and writers work to combat the oversimplification that's coming out of the propaganda machine?
Well, it's not the problem is not oversimplification. The problem is of a kind of nationalism that eulogizes the densest military occupation in the world and demonizes the people. So you have a situation where you have an internet siege in Kashmir, where since August 5th last year, on and off, but mostly on. And so at this point, I mean, imagine the world locked down for coronavirus. Everyone, we are all doing this. Kashmiris can't do this, and for many months they couldn't even make phone calls. So business collapse, students, hospitals, courts. So it's a kind of mass violation of human rights that I think is unprecedented in the world, this digital siege. First, you push everyone into a digital era, and then you say, oh, Kashmiris don't need the internet. They only use it for pornography and terrorism. Like this is what, sort of senior government people say. So, and then you have this 24/7 propaganda. And so, but you have a lot of people, including a lot of young Indians, I think, who have, begun to feel the fact that to let this happen in your name it eventually corrodes you. So it's not some altruistic thing you're doing on behalf of someone else, but only to honor yourself, to say, I'm sorry, but this is just not something that I find acceptable, but it's very, very frightening, because people are picked up, arrested. I mean, for me, for example, people have said, okay, she should be tied to a tank and used as a human shield, or, if I do a book launch, then they'll come and smash up the stage or whatever. But, these things have to be said. And it is ultimately, I said it long ago, and I'll say it again, that India needs Azadi from Kashmir almost more than Kashmir needs Azadi from India, because India is its ship is sinking, and a lot of it is because of this hate-fueled, blind rage that it can't manage to see through,
And sort of a final question is, how, especially I think with the case of Kashmir, what are the possibilities for solidarity, not just within India, but I think internationally with the Kashmiri cause? Because I believe, it's something that I'll admit ignorance on. I see it peripherally in a lot of kind of advocacy work and movement work, but I think in this moment in time, especially with the George Floyd protests and the current pandemic, that there are possibilities for solidarity. And what what does that look like?
That's obviously, I think first, before any kind of solidarity can be embarked upon, one needs to understand what's going on there, So I'd say that the solidarity could begin with reading. And there's an organization in Kashmir called the JKCCS, the Jammu Kashmir Coalition for Civil Society. It has a website. It's recently brought out a really brilliant report on the internet siege. It should be available online. And I think, it's something that people need to read and understand what is being done to people, hundreds of people, it's apart from thousands of people being killed, people being blinded by pellets and now put under this siege, which is absolutely inhuman.
And then one last question. What are you currently reading?
Oh my goodness. I just finished reading, for 2 days after that, I could hardly see because the type was so small, and it's like 2,000 page biography of Hitler by Ian Kershaw. But yeah, that's what I was currently reading. I just finished it like a couple of days ago. And then started reading quite a beautiful book by the Chinese writer Yu Hua. I think it's called China in 10 Words. It's really lovely.
Well, thank you so much, Arundhati, for taking the time for this interview. I have a lot more questions, but sadly I have to turn it over to you.
When we meet.
Yeah, when we meet in person.
Yes, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And at this point, I'm coming in, at least audibly, I'm not sure if I am visually, but to thank both Nick and Arundhati. As she said, one of the things to do from this is read, and to read her work, to read Nick's work. I will say, because of a particular thing, that the Doctrine of the Saint, which she really had an insistence about, that is available as its own freestanding book from Haymarket, but it's also contained within My Seditious Heart. So that's all in there to read and to understand the nuance, because there is so much complication and nuance when we try and do things quickly. Another little comment I'll just make, because Nick, in his role, this last part, he was asking about international work and solidarity, and he's been doing a lot of work with Palestine, and that for the work comes from here in North America. There's a lot of affinity and learning and rapport there. So that is an example. Since we didn't quite get into a specific one, but I know Nick has done that. I don't know how people where Arundhati is are going to go to bed on this, because this is like it's nighttime. Nick, where he is and where we are, I'm not used to having this much to go into a day with in terms of what I feel full with, and what I think others here are going to take from this, and that's true of all the North America. So much, and yes, to continue when the two of you can be in the same place together and continue, and it'll be even deeper.
Seriously.
Because
the Elliott
yes.
Bay Bookshop, we're coming there.
Yes, we will do. We will go wherever. I left out some of the infomercial parts, which is to order books and buy books, because we do have copies of Azadi on publication today. I think there's probably been little Anthony has been putting some links to buy the books. We also have Nick's books, Our History is the Future, and the Standing Rock, the anthology. And we also have Arundhati's other books, the novels and My Seditious Heart. So on that note, as there's still so much to say and for all of us to carry, heartfelt thanks from us to all those who've been part of this, to Anthony and Sean and John of Haymarket, to Shahina and Rita and Roshni and Alka of Tasveer, to all my colleagues at Elliott Bay Book Company, and certainly most fully to Arundhati and Nick themselves. And we've got a lot of work to do, but we also have, and part of that's the reading, but then all the rest that comes with it. And these two people are doing so much to make this a more just and better place, a better world. So with that, for everyone involved, we thank you and bid you good night, good morning, good day, and take care. And thank you.